1944 and you are an Allied commander in World War II, carefully managing logistics and supplies while racing to liberate France and the Low Countries and beat the other Allied commanders across the Rhine in Keep 'em Rolling, Race to the Rhine, which was designed by Jaro Andruskevich, Valentin Crespel, Remy Dufourneau, Waldek Gumieni, and Yves Roig, and published by Phalanx, who sponsored this video. Hi everyone, my name is Candace Harris from Board Game Geek. We've got to gather our supplies and beat our opponents to the Rhine. So let's get down to the table to learn how to play Keep 'em Rolling, Race to the Rhine. Keep 'em Rolling, Race to the Rhine is a new edition of the highly popular operations and logistics-focused Euro war game 1944 Race to the Rhine. Race to the Rhine is based on the historical events of the year 1944. You and up to 3 opponents take on the roles of commanders of different sections of the Allied forces, tasked with liberating France and the Low Countries and moving your forces onwards across the Rhine and into Nazi Germany. You'll move your corps, gain and transport supplies, and deal with Axis units who try to interfere with your plans. This new edition of Race to the Rhine adds a 4th player option, new Axis automa for alternative Axis reaction mechanics, new components, a new standalone solitaire game, and more. Before we load up our trucks and get ready to roll, let's go over the setup for Keep 'em Rolling, Race to the Rhine. To begin setup, place the game board in the center of the table on the side corresponding to your player count. For this video, I'll be setting up a 4-player game, so the board is on the Patch Devers side with the Patch Devers board added to the right side. Choose or randomly determine which commander each player will be. In a game of less than 4 players, all commanders selected must be adjacent to each other. So if you're playing a 2-player game, you cannot play with Montgomery and Patton. Place your commander card and corps cards in your player area beneath your respective starting area on the board. See numbers 3 through 6 in the setup steps on page 6 of the rulebook for each commander's list of corps cards. Then place supply markers on the corps cards matching the supplies printed on the cards, leaving any blank spaces empty. Next, place your control markers, air support marker, and 6 trucks in your player area. Shuffle and place your pursuit deck face down in your player area. Each commander's pursuit deck has 22 cards with an icon matching the commander's icon. Shuffle the Axis unit cards and place them face down on the side of the game board. In a 4-player game, use all 31 cards. For games with 1, 2, or 3 players, randomly remove 7 cards so that there are 24 in the game. Place the access markers in a supply next to the access unit cards. The number to be placed varies by player count, so see setup step 11 to make sure you place the correct number of access markers. Place the medals near the board. On the board, place your core blocks lying horizontally face up in the corresponding starting areas. Place 6 trucks on the Allied truck stock on the board. Then place the remaining trucks in a separate reserve near the board. Place supply markers on the general stock based on the number of players. Place any remaining supply markers in a separate supply pool by the side of the board. Next, place control markers of each commander to indicate their current level on the logistics table. Bradley on 2 and all other commanders on 1. Place airborne support markers equal to the number of players plus 1 on the airborne support track. Randomly determine the first player and place one of their control markers on the first spot on the player order track, then the remaining players in clockwise order. If you're playing with Montgomery, place the Austin marker on the Austin space. If you're playing a game with less than 4 players, block any double-colored spaces featuring the colors of commanders not in play with their control markers. A corps cannot move into any of these spaces. When playing with Patch and Devers, place the General Patch commander card on top of the General Devers commander card. After the first logistics step, the Patch card will be removed from play. You'll also place FFI markers in the 3 Maquis zones according to the number indicated in the zone, and 1 FFI marker in each FFI starting space. Now you're ready to make your way across the Rhine. Keep 'em Rolling, Race to the Rhine is played over a series of rounds until a commander successfully crosses the Rhine or the last access marker in the supply is placed. You win the game immediately if you were the first player to place a control marker in a victory space across the Rhine, and you can trace an unbroken chain of spaces with your control markers from that space back to your starting area. Or you win the game if you have the most medals at the end of the round that the last access marker in the pool was placed. Each round, in turn order, each player takes actions, then resolves the access reaction. Whoever's playing as Patch Devers also has an FFI movement phase in between taking actions and resolving the access reaction. Let's go over the player actions first. Each player takes 2 core actions and any number of bonus actions, and these may be done in any order. You can also take the same type of action more than once. The core actions you can take are move a core, take supplies, truck supplies, take trucks, air support, or airborne landing. Let's look at movement first, since it's arguably the most important action when you're racing to cross the Rhine first. To move a core, spend 1 fuel from your core supply, and then you may move the core up to 3 spaces, noting you may not move the same core more than once in the same round. Anytime you spend supplies for movement or when resolving combat, return them to the supply pool. A core may only enter spaces that have your commander's background color, including double-colored spaces. You can move a core backwards or forwards. The direction of the arrows between the spaces is for thematic purposes only. A core may not enter a space containing another core or a control marker of another commander. If your core enters a space without an allied control marker, you must either draw an access card and resolve a combat if that space has an access marker or an access flag, or draw a pursuit card from your pursuit deck. If you ever run out of cards to draw in your pursuit deck, shuffle the discard pile and create a new draw deck. Pursuit cards have a variety of different effects that are summarized well on the player aids for reference. I'll go over how combat is resolved later, but after resolving the card and any combat, place a control marker of your color on the space, and place the resolved card in the appropriate discard pile. Remember, you can move a core up to 3 spaces, so if the core has any movement allowance remaining and it hasn't been halted, it may continue to move. If you draw a card with the halt icon, which is on all the access unit cards, after resolving the card, the core movement ends, even if it hasn't moved its full 3-space allowance. However, you can spend 1 additional fuel to ignore the halt icon and continue the core movement up to its allowance. If you enter a fortified space indicated by this bunker icon and it doesn't have an allied control marker, you must pay 1 ammo or you cannot enter the space. After entering the space, you'll draw the relevant card as usual. If you enter a space with a medal icon, after placing a control marker, take a medal from the supply and place it in your player area. If at any point you lose control of the space due to an access counterattack, you must return the medal to the supply. The double-colored spaces indicate 2 different commanders can potentially control it. You may enter a double-colored space unless there's a control marker from another commander already on it. After placing a control marker, if you cut off other connected uncontrolled spaces from tracing a continuous chain of uncontrolled spaces to Dusseldorf or Karlsruhe, those spaces are encircled. Once a core's movement has finished, check for encirclement and place control markers in the color of the encircled space. In the case of double-colored spaces being encircled, the active player gains control of the encircled spaces. It's important to note that spaces with an access marker or flag cannot become encircled. Also, if a metal space becomes encircled, the player placing the control marker takes the medal, and fortified spaces are treated like normal spaces when it comes to encirclement. At any point while you're moving a core, you can drop off supplies in spaces with your control marker and within the supply limits of the space, and you can pick up supplies and move them onto the core card. If there's no space on the core card, existing supplies can be swapped out and left on the corresponding space following supply limits. With the Take Supplies action, you place supplies in your main supply base or a limited supply base that you control. A limited supply base is the same as a normal space, except that once you have your control marker on the space, you can place supplies directly there instead of your main supply base. If you're placing supplies in your main supply base, you may take either 3 of one type of supply from the general stock if they're available, or 1 of each type from the supply pool. If you're placing supplies in a limited supply base, you can only take 1 of each type from the supply pool. The amount of supplies in the general stock is limited, and once it's all taken, you can't take any more from the general stock until it's refreshed after the next logistics step, which I'll cover in a bit. On the other hand, the amount of supplies in the supply pool is limited only by the number of components in the game. When you take supplies, place the supplies in the chosen space and make sure you meet the supply limits. Up to 6 supplies on a limited supply base and up to 9 supplies on a main supply base, which is noted on the player aids. If you ever have more supplies than the limit, you must remove excess supplies of your choice back to the supply pool until the amount of supplies is within the limit. These limits only apply to your bases and do not apply to supplies held on core cards of a core in the same space. Supplies can be moved between adjacent spaces either by being transported by a core as part of a move action or through a truck supplies action. Using the truck supplies action allows you to place available trucks up to your logistics level from your player area to transport up to 5 supplies per truck from one space to an adjacent space. A truck can be placed on any route between adjacent spaces as long as you control both spaces between the route and there isn't already a truck on that route. In addition, you cannot place more trucks in an action than permitted by your logistics level. You can pick up and drop off supplies freely as part of this action as long as you don't exceed supply limits. And the trucks you place don't need to be in a chain. You can place them at different routes as long as, again, you control both spaces in between the route, there's not already a truck on the route, and you are not placing more trucks per action than you're allowed to based on your logistics level. Each player begins the game with 6 trucks in their player area, but you can gain more trucks by performing the Take Trucks action, where you take a number of trucks from the allied truck stock up to the amount permitted by your current logistics level and place them in your player area, noting you may never exceed the maximum amount of trucks allowed based on your logistics level. If immediately following this action, there are no trucks left in the allied truck stock, play is interrupted to resolve the logistics step. If the player that triggered the logistics step still has actions left to take, they can be taken after the logistics step is resolved. When the logistics step is triggered, all players must perform the following steps. First, move your logistics level up on the logistics level table by the amount indicated on the track. Once all commanders are on level 3, they cannot advance any further, so this step only applies to the first and second logistics steps. Next, remove all trucks from the map and place them in the allied truck stop. Then add trucks to the allied truck stop from the separate reserve by the side of the board created during setup. Add 2 trucks, then an additional 2 trucks per player. This only occurs once during the first logistics step of the game. Next, refill the general stock with the appropriate number of supplies based on player count. Then you have to feed each of your core by spending a food either from its card or from the space it's located in. If it cannot do this, you must flip over the core block to its blank side. It cannot take a move action until a food supply has been moved to its space. Feeding a core is not optional. An unfed core will always spend a food supply if it enters its space. These soldiers need to eat. After feeding your core, if you're able to, unflip all spent commander cards. They can now be used again. Finally, return all spent air support markers that are next to the access and pursuit decks. They can now be used again as well. Speaking of air support, as an action, you may place your air support marker on the top card of your pursuit deck or the access deck to secretly view the next card to be drawn from the corresponding deck. Leave the marker on the top card of the deck until it is drawn. It'll give you an additional ammo towards any combat that results from the draw. Once the card is drawn, the marker becomes spent and can't be used again until after the next logistics step. I'll also note that multiple air support markers can potentially be placed on the same access card, but each marker only supports the commander whose color it is. All air support markers are spent when the access card is drawn. The last core action is Airborne Landing. When you perform the Airborne Landing action, you may place up to 3 Airborne Landing markers to support a future combat. To do so, discard 1 metal marker from your player area for each Airborne Landing marker you wish to use, and it must be a metal marker, not a defeated Axis unit with a metal icon. Then place each Airborne Landing marker green side up on a space you don't control, including a space with an access marker, but you may only place 1 marker per space. If you don't use an Airborne Landing marker to support combat in the turn that it was placed, flip it over to its gray side. Then if it's not used at the end of your next turn, remove it from the game. If any corps enters the space with an Airborne Landing marker, regardless of which commander placed the marker, they receive a +1 ammo bonus, which can be used to support a combat or to pay the 1 ammo cost for entering a fortified space. After it's used, the marker is removed from the game. As I mentioned earlier, on your turn, you'll take 2 core actions and any number of bonus actions in any order. So let's go over the 2 options you have for bonus actions. As a bonus action, you can play a held pursuit card. Some resistance and recon pursuit cards have this hold symbol, and when you draw them, you can either use them immediately or you can hold them in your hand to play later as a bonus action. There's no limit to the number of cards with this icon that you can hold in your hand or the number you can play on a turn as a bonus action. The second bonus action option is to use a commander's special ability. Each commander has a special ability printed on their commander card, which is explained on the corresponding commander's player aid. After using a commander's ability, flip the card over to show that it's exhausted. It becomes refreshed when the logistics step is triggered. At that point, you can flip it back over and use the special ability again. I will point out that some commanders' special abilities are passive, such as Montgomery's special ability. In this case, it boosts the take supplies action and is not something that needs to be exhausted. It's an ongoing passive ability. Let's go over how combat works next. During a movement action, when you enter an access space, you'll draw an access card with an access unit, and you may encounter access units in your pursuit deck as well. In either case, you must resolve a combat with the corresponding access unit. To defeat an access unit, you must spend supplies from your core card matching the requirement printed on the top left of the corresponding unit card. The requirements range from 1 to 3 ammo, or it could be 2 ammo and 1 fuel. If your core meets the requirement, remove the required supplies from the core card, place a control marker on the space, removing the access marker back to the supply if there was one on the space, and then place the defeated access unit card in your play area. It'll count towards your final number of medals for endgame scoring. If the core is unable to meet the requirement on the access card, then remove as many ammo and fuel markers as possible based on the card's requirements, move the defeated core back to the space it entered from, and its movement action ends. In this case, you cannot continue movement by paying another fuel like when you're halted. Then shuffle the access unit card back into the appropriate deck. As you can see, combat is very straightforward, but there are a few additional rules to keep in mind. If your core is entering an uncontrolled fortified space, it must pay the 1 ammo cost before drawing the relevant card. If the card you draw has your air support marker on it, or if the space being entered has an Airborne Landing marker on it, you gain +1 ammo for resolving the combat. And if there are both, you gain +2 ammo. Lastly, if your commander is Patch or Devers, your core can gain additional ammo from FFI markers present in the space where the combat is occurring. After you finish taking your core actions and any bonus actions, there's an access reaction phase. However, if you're playing as Patch and Devers, before moving to the access reaction phase, there's an FFI movement phase where you'll move a single FFI marker from a marquee zone to an adjacent space or vice versa, or move an FFI marker from one space to an adjacent space. The FFI markers have a few different impacts in the game. Access markers can't be placed in a space containing an FFI marker. If either French corps enters a space with at least one FFI marker, you may discard the markers and replenish the French corps card with ammo markers equal to the number of FFI markers. If the US 6th Corps enters a space with at least one FFI marker, you may discard the markers to gain an immediate +1 ammo bonus for any combat that occurs in that space. There's a whole section of special rules with some historical background on pages 20 and 21 of the rulebook, which I recommend checking out if you're playing with Patch and Devers. But now, let's go over the access reaction phase, which happens after each player takes their turn. The access reaction could be to counterattack by removing control markers from unprotected spaces, or to place access markers in uncontrolled spaces, or both. There are two variants for how it works, Ultra or OB West. Before starting the game, you should decide on which variant you want to play. With the Ultra variant, you may either do a single counterattack or place an access marker. If both options are available, you choose which you want to do. A counterattack allows you to remove a control marker of another commander as long as it's not in the same space or adjacent to any allied core or adjacent to an allied starting area, and it's adjacent to an uncontrolled space that can trace a continuous chain of uncontrolled spaces to Dusseldorf or Karlsruhe. Access markers or flags in any of these uncontrolled spaces have no effect on the counterattack. Also remember, if a control marker is removed from a metal space, the commander that lost control of the space must return the metal to the supply. Early in the game, it's unlikely that any player will be able to make counterattacks since they become more common as core move up the map and it becomes harder for players to defend controlled spaces by having their core adjacent to them. Instead of counterattacking, or if it's not an option, you can place an access marker from the supply on an empty space that is adjacent to a victory space with an access flag, or that's adjacent to a space already containing an access marker, and that marker can trace a continuous chain of access markers to a victory space with an access flag. If there's no eligible space to place an access marker when you need to, remove one from the game. With the OB West variant, you must always counterattack, including against your own control markers. Then you must also place an access marker based on the priority placement schedule on each commander's player aid. For example, after a counterattack, Bradley would place an access marker in Munz, and if Munz already had one, then Hirson, which is next in priority order. Again, you'll continue playing round after round, with each player taking a turn and resolving an access reaction until a commander successfully crosses the Rhine or the last access marker in the supply is placed. You win the game immediately if you are the first player to place a control marker in a victory space across the Rhine, and you can trace an unbroken chain of spaces with your control markers from that space back to your starting area. If the end of the game is triggered from the last access marker being placed, play continues until the end of the round, meaning the last player on the player order track finishes taking all of their actions and then the game ends. Even if later in the last round access markers are returned to the supply after combat, the game still ends. The winner is the player with the most medals after totaling each player's medal markers, defeated access units with a medal printed on the card, and you'll also score a medal for every 5 ammo icons on defeated access unit cards rounded down, which are not marked with a medal. And that's how you play Keep 'em Rolling Race to the Rhine. There are a few optional rules you can mix in, as well as a separate set of rules for the These Are My Credentials solitaire game, but I'll leave you to discover those on your own. Keep 'em Rolling Race to the Rhine is a very unique game that cleverly blends Eurogame mechanisms with a historical war game setting. It's all about planning and managing your supplies and logistics more efficiently than your opponents. It's a very engaging game that keeps you on the edge of your seat since you're racing to beat your opponents, but you also have to be prepared if the game ends before someone crosses over the Rhine, in which case you'll want to make sure you have the most medals. Also, the player aids are awesome, and they do a great job at keeping your head out of the rulebook so you can focus on the game. If Keep 'em Rolling Race to the Rhine looks like a game you'd enjoy, be sure to check out its page on Board Game Geek to learn more. I'm Candace Harris from Board Game Geek, and that is how you play Keep 'em Rolling Race to the Rhine. Have a wonderful day.